Greetings all, welcome back to another Tuesday Talk. We're going to finish our discussions here about the birth of Old English and some of the transitions here with the introduction of the Benedictine Reform and also how everything changes during the Norman Conquest when England falls to the Normans, to the Vikings. So let's just begin. We'll continue talking a little bit more about what happened during the Benedictine Reform. Now, in the last video that we were talking about, I mentioned King Alfred, or Alfred the Great King. He was one who had conquered the Vikings who had come to destroy them and take over. And through a number of battles, he pushed back the Vikings, and he also unified the lower part of the island, actually the lower and middle part of the island. So he did many good things there. One of the things that he did, though, was that he pushed for education reform, introducing a lot of the things from his Christian roots, that being a lot of the Latin, the alphabet, and other types of things from there. He also recruits a lot of people from the mainland, from Italy, from France, to come and educate, train, and also to write. So he recruits scholars to come to the island. Now he dies around 900. So he's only around maybe about 12 or 15 years after the end of the battle. But what he does is he succeeds in making all of this one nation. Now, up in here, again, there are still some Vikings who are living, and of course up in here there are the Scots and whatnot. This area down here, although it is somewhat controlled by Celts and of the Celtic language, they're going to be joining very soon this whole lower kingdom, and so you're going to see a big change from here. All this is going to eventually be controlled, and primarily it's going to be due to the work that Alfred did. After Alfred dies, a couple of years later, about 40 or 50 years later, Athelwold comes to prominence. He's a monk and a bishop, and he continues to push Old English and to push linguistic standards. And throughout his life, England is growing, and eventually it encompasses all of the main island. Athelwold is a great teacher and a great educator, and he is pushing for this education throughout his life. I guess education and Christianity, they do go hand in hand. So he's trying to push for this. During his lifetime, there were 6 different kings, and he served under all of them. And he established monasteries and nunneries. Again, these were places primarily for education and also mercy, to provide for local areas, and so that was their job. But Athelwold was one who was trying to push this. He worked on educating the clergy, worked on educating the laity, so that they could understand and that they could articulate, speak in a common language. He also worked on establishing a literary standard, ways of writing, ways of speaking. Again, never before done in the English-speaking world. All of this is Old English. And so he's beginning this process of trying to standardize what's going on. It's also possible that he may have taught one of the 6 kings under which he ruled, and that would be King Edgar. So Athelwold is a very important person in the history of the English language, obviously of English as well, the history of the English language and how it progressed and moved and solidified Old English during this time. After Athelwold leaves, after he goes on, the next great Benedictine reformer in England is going to be a gentleman named Ælfric. Now, Ælfric was an abbot, and he was also an Old English writer. And he taught, and he was taught and he was schooled by Athelwold. Hey, I forgot to mention this. Nice little character here, right? We don't have it anymore. We have the sound A-E, as in apple. But we don't have this letter anymore. That's a letter that's primarily seen in Old and some Middle English. Eventually it gets dropped. So you see some of the interesting things that's listed here as far as these people are concerned. Ælfric was a very big writer. He wrote sermons and homilies. He wrote paraphrases of the Bible so that it could be more easily understood. So he was a prolific writer. bear in mind when I say he's a writer, he's writing quill to paper. Okay, there is no printing that's going on here. Everything is handwritten. And that takes a long time. We type something up, we copy it, and we can make 1,000,000 copies in no time. For them, it was a very arduous task. It took time. And if I wanted to make a copy of something, there was no standard for doing that. Well, that's one of the things that he did. He taught and he dictated the rules for copying a text. Copying text is a big deal back then because someone makes a mistake, and what do? So oftentimes the text had to be destroyed, especially if you were dealing with a sacred text. And so there were a whole litany of procedures. How big the paper or how big the skin had to be, how it was processed. Someone had to write it, someone then had to check it. And there were just a whole list of things that needed to be done. And Ælfric is one of the people in England, anyway, who is trying to standardize this so that people can learn how to do this so that there's reliability. That was the main thing that he was looking for. And obviously, we can now go back and compare up and down the tree of documents to see how that was. But Ælfric was very important in laying down those rules for copying text. He also wanted to stress a consistent grammatical system. And you and I, we kind of think, well, grammatical systems are set in stone. Actually, they're not, unless there's someone there to set them in stone, to set them down and say you're not allowed to change things. Just think of the people who use language and they don't use it properly. I'll oftentimes walk into the office and I'll say, how be you? And people will look at me, how be you? I communicated my idea, right? How are you? But I didn't use the proper structure. Now, the people who are hearing me understood exactly what I was saying. So I got my idea across, but I didn't use the proper grammatical structure. It's at this point where Ælfric starts to say to people, no, you're not supposed to say it that way. Let's keep consistent. Let's continue using the same format. And so this is one of the early people who's trying to establish a system so that it can become standardized. He also stresses the use of Latin words for English speakers. In other words, he's stressing non-English words that people should be using. We have foreign words all over the place, things like biology and court. These are words that are not quote-unquote English words, but they were brought in from outside, and people started to tell us we should be using these words. And that's what Ælfric is doing here. He's trying to stress that we normal English speakers start to pull in these Latin words, right? He tried to standardize the vocabulary as well. Use this word, don't use that word. Spell this word, don't spell that word that way. So he starts to try to refine what's going on. He's building up the language, okay? He sees the advantage of having things standardized. During this time, there's 600 years in the Old English time. There is a bunch of prose and poetry that was developed. I mentioned before the Cadmean manuscript, and it was an illustrated poetic anthology, and we do have it still. So there are places where you can go look for it. There's the Exeter book, which is also an anthology, a collection of materials and writings. The Vercelli books is a mixture of poetry, prose, and it's from Vercelli, Italy, but it has Old English in it. The Noel Codex, again, mixture of poetry and prose, and it also includes the story of Beowulf, and you probably have seen or read about Beowulf. Well, this is what it looks like in the Old English. Again, there's that letter that we had talked about earlier, right? It's a letter that we don't have anymore. And there are many other letters that are in here. We have this letter here, okay, that looks like a D, but it's not. It's actually a TH sound, okay? And so they had this letter. Here's a letter that you look at and you think, oh, it looks kind of like a P or kind of like a B. It's actually, again, a TH sound. Here it is again. So normal English speakers are going to look at this and not going to be able to read it. However, there are many letters that look similar. Here's an E, here's an A, right? Here's an EA again, an H, okay? How you pronounce them may be a little different, but at least this looks more English-like. because we've taken away all of those runes, the Anglo-Saxon runes, and we started replacing them with other ones. Now, here's one that looks more runic, the F. And if you remember from the last video, you'll see that that was also one that was similar there. So there is some overlap, but you have a lot of these new characters that are being used, and a lot of them are being obviously written down here. Here's another example, and hopefully you can see some of these symbols here. Here again is that TH symbol that I was mentioning before. Here's the other one, right? And then you've got ones that you know, things like, here's a C, there's an E, right? There's an E and N. That looks like an F, right? Of course, N here. This is also Old English, right? Here's something from the Exeter book, which is also Old English. And again, you see some things that are very similar. I mean, this looks almost like Madolad, right? I can almost pronounce this. But again, you're going to have stuff in here that you don't know, things that don't make any sense. Again, here's the TH sound that I was mentioning before, right? So this is the stuff that's coming along during the time of Athelwold and Ælfric, and these are the people who are pushing this idea so that they could improve and grow the English language. And it really did grow. There were some poets later on who actually, even though they were from France or from Italy, they decided to write in English, which I find very interesting. You'll see that coming along later in Middle and Early Modern English. So during this reform of the monasteries and nunneries that have gone through, all of these people were teachers, and they were teaching laity, they were teaching clergy how to write, how to read, and how to grow and standardize the language. Very big and important thing. This was one reason why Old English grew to the state that it was in. There were two different types of poetry. There was heroic, which is something like Beowulf, where you had from a dramatic background, and you had Christian poetry. Diction also became more important. That was word choice, the words that they chose, again, pulling in new Latin words. So the vocabulary really grew, not only from the Latin, but also, again, from the north you have the Vikings, the Norse, and they're introducing vocabulary as well. Now, again, they've been pushed back, so they're in the upper segments, okay, and they're living up there all good, well, and happy, okay. Obviously, there's another group that's over in France, in Normandy. But you see a lot of interaction between all of these languages. You still have the Celts and the Celts here. You still have some origins of Anglo-Saxon in the Old English, and you still have now Latin coming in from the church. So you see a lot of nice vocabulary within this growing Old English system. A lot of their writing often employed alliteration. Okay, I hope you don't remember what alliteration is, but that their writings included that. So if you can read Old English, you'd be able to see that. 1099, big change. 1099 is basically, that's the end of Old English, okay, the decline and the end of Old English. And the reason why is because the Norman Conquest begins in 1099. 1099, the Normans from Normandy, basically the Vikings, they come and they attack again England, and they win. And so a tremendous political, cultural, social upheaval, okay, in the wake of the Norman Conquest. The Norman Conquest was a pivotal event in England's history. It largely removed the native ruling class, replacing them with the foreign French-speaking monarchy. So we have all these people here who are your native English speakers, and then on top of them you have the new royalty, the new government, as it were, and they all speak French, right? French-speaking monarchy and aristocracy, and the clergy, okay? This in turn brings about a transformation in language. Okay, the people at the top are changing everything, and the people, as you go down, all of these things are going to filter down, and it's going to change the English language, right? It's going to change the culture as well. Begins a new era known as Norman England. Okay, and this is right out of Wikipedia if you want to go look at that. But it's a tremendous change because of the Norman invasion. You want to go online and learn more about what the Normans did and what the conquests were, you can go do that. but it's a major change. And again, if you remember, all of this area primarily is what was at stake, okay? And what happens is, this is what they come and attack. And you can, again, read the details to find out that they lost all of these battles. And because they were defeated, the people were not enslaved, but basically the aristocracy was taken over and taxes were being levied. And so English has been severely damaged because of it. All right. The French, okay, mainly from Normandy, as I mentioned before. And remember, the Normans were there in England, in France, because they had their own little place there. They didn't mingle very much with the French. And that's why that place is called Normandy, because they're not French. They're Normans or Vikings. So during World War II, when the Allied forces went in to attack France to get rid of the Germans, and they went to Normandy, the place that they went to was the place where the Vikings set up their home away from home, as it were, for a couple hundred years before they came back and attacked England. The Normans placed a new royalty in England, and they established French to be the language of the court. So now, if you want to be involved in the court, you must speak that language. This is typical for a lot of places where there's a war and your country loses, and a new language is now imposed upon you. It's happened in Asia, it's happened in Europe, it's happened in Africa, and it's happened in the Middle East. So you see that happen quite often. We now have a two-tiered system. We have the people down here, and this is the normal language they speak, which is, again, Old English, and you have the upper tier. And they're now going to start interacting with each other and changing the nature of language. Big change. Some of the linguistic influences included something called a reduction in inflections. And if you remember, an inflection is the change of a word so that you know it's a subject, or the change of a word so that you know it's a verb or an object or an indirect object. They had all these inflections. And now in English, in modern English, we don't have them today. I say the word banana, and you don't know whether it's a subject or an object or a verb, or a subject or an object or an indirect object. Better not be a verb. So these things start to drop away. Okay, if I have within the word that I know it's a subject, right? Then I can put it anywhere in the sentence because I know it's the subject. But if I take away that subject marker, now I've got to have things in better order so that things can be understood. So we have a reduction in inflections, but we have an increase in word order. Just to give you an example, I can say, I marry you. In English, I can also say, I, you marry. I, thee wed. Thee, okay, which is you, is also similar to thou, right? Okay? And because we have things like thee and thou, and you and thee, we have different orders, we have different meanings for these words as far as location in the sentence, and that way I can move them around. I can say, I thee wed. It's a little harder for me to say, I you wed. It's a little harder for me to do that nowadays because we don't have those separations. So we have a reduction in inflections, and we have an increase in word order. Now word order is important. We have to now put things in proper order. Whereas in the past, we could move things around. It didn't necessarily matter. The other interesting thing is the increase in vocabulary, because we're borrowing lots of words. And really what this creates is something called doublets. And there are actually triplets as well. But a doublet is basically, in English, we have multiple words for the same thing. For example, we have a word cow, which is an Anglo word, but we also have the word beef, which is a Norman French word. And we have calf and veal and swine and pork. We have sheep and mutton. We have deer and venison. We have sweat and perspire. We have a lot of words like this. You can go look up even more where you have multiple words. And it's interesting that a lot of the words that we use for food are French words, and a lot of the words that we use for animals are Anglo-Saxon words. You look down here between these words, between the words sweat and perspire, right? Which word is more elegant? Which word is more proper? Which word has a better view, a better connotation? Would be the word perspire. Okay, why? Because it came from the French, and the French were the quote-unquote upper class at the time. Okay, that's how that comes down to us. That's what we get a lot of doubling for, because we've imported all these new French words. And so now they become part of our language. And so now we've got doublets. Some places we even have triplets, because we have three words coming from, two words coming from a different location, and then we have our own word. The word I actually like is the word, well, let's move on here. There's a huge increase in vocabulary because of this invasion. We have, in government, we have words like count, as in the Count of Monte Cristo, heraldry and nobility and parliament. These are all French words. We have a lot of military words like battle and alliance, and ensign, admiral, gallant. Okay, again, all French words. We have words added to the judicial system like plaintiff and justice and attorney and murder. Again, all of these are French words. We have words that have entered the church: clergy, altar, preach, pray, sermon. We have words in cuisine, and something tells me the word cuisine is actually a French word. We have things like sauce and filet, soup and pastry. Personal names that have been added from French, right? We have words like John and Mary and Charles and William. So things have been added to the system. Going back to doublets, one that I particularly like to stress that we have is the words sin and crime. Typically, when you have new words or new changes in coming into the system, the one group that does not like change is the church. So the old Anglo-Saxon word that we had for crime was the word sin. If you committed a sin, it's the word crime that we use today. The French now conquer, right? The Normans now conquer England, and then they replace the word sin with the word crime. Now they mean the same thing, okay? Everybody used sin all the time to mean anybody who committed any type of infraction against the state. The church also used it as an infraction against God law. But we have these two words now. And what happens is everybody starts using the word crime because that was the language of the day. That was the language that the upper class was using, so we were all supposed to use it. The church continues to use the word sin, and now we get a dichotomy in the meaning of the word. Today, some people say, well, sin is only related to God's law, but in the original, they both meant the same thing: crime. That's not necessarily a doublet, but it's interesting to see how the church hung on to this old word, and it started having a different meaning with the people. But the actual original word was the same as crime, another type of doublet that we got during this time. And that's all right now. That's basically the end of Old English, okay? The Norman Conquest begins to just drastically change the language in such a way that Old English is now going to go away. We're going to lose letters. We're going to lose inflections. We're going to start gaining things that look more like modern English. Not going to be the same. We're eventually going to be moving into modern Middle English next. And you'll be able to see those changes, as well as the history that is involved in making those changes come about. If you do have questions, please get a hold of me. If not, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye now.